If you like wine as much as I do, then like me, you've probably been searching for a way to tie wine and IT together. And believe it or not, I may have found it. And it just may be the secret to creating an amazing IT culture. Hi, I'm Charles Araujo, and you're watching the Transform IT Show, presented by the Intel IT Center. Today is going to be a fun and casual episode. A few weeks ago, I sat down with Frank Wander. Frank has had a fascinating career that led him from being a turnaround CIO at one of the largest companies in the US to becoming the author of a book called Transforming IT Culture. And what he has to share with us about the importance of culture and how to look at your team differently may surprise you. If you're watching this episode at airtime, don't forget to participate in our live Twitter chat. Use hashtag ITChat to participate. And if you're not, make sure you catch the next one live so that you can join in the conversation. Okay, here we go. It's time for wine, culture, and people to come together. I'm here with Frank Wander, the former CIO at Guardian Life and a number of other places, and author of the book Transforming IT Culture. Frank, welcome to the Transform IT Show.
Listen, absolutely thrilled to be here. Thank you, Charles.
Great. And I love our setting, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. But I want to dive right in and talk about one of my favorite subjects, culture. And of course, you wrote the book on culture. And I think it's interesting, you and I met because our respective books came out at a similar time, and we ended up writing cover quotes for each other's books. And so just tell me about how did you kind of go down this road about focusing on culture?
I realized from all the turnaround transformations I did that culture really represented how we work together. You know, companies are very good at understanding their processes, which is how work gets done, and governance, which is how decisions get made, but they really hadn't defined how they work together. So I became fascinated by it because ultimately IT is all about a lot of people working together to do great things.
And so you coined this phrase, and I don't remember exactly it, human capital or human infrastructure, right?
Human infrastructure.
And so talk to us about what that means.
Well, I came to the conclusion that when people work together, right, there are all these human factors involved in how they actually interact with one another. Human factors of innovation, leadership, collaboration. And I realized companies had great tools to gain insight into how their networks were working, their computers, even the building, management system that would check on the elevators. But for the human infrastructure, there was nothing because, they're just disposable parts in most companies.
I think it's interesting. Obviously I spend a lot of time talking with CIOs. You have been a CIO for a long time. And it's kind of like there's this weird thing when it comes to culture. We all talk about it. And yet when you get in and start talking to, in my opinion, really executives, a lot of times they kind of roll their eyes a little bit like, yeah, of course culture is really important, but they aren't really doing anything about it. I mean, you took it to a very definitive level, right? How did that play out or how did that happen?
I became fascinated by culture. And as I dug into the human factors, I realized that there were so many different factors like expectations, meaning, all the things that drive collaboration, which are pro-social behaviors and others, that just don't have to be an accident. You can design all this stuff into the environment. And I became very interested in culture by design, really. And more importantly, what are those human factors that really drive great success? And I put those into the book with the intent of the book being an operator's manual of sorts, the missing operator's manual for the human infrastructure, basically.
But I mean, I think what's important about this, because there's people like me that, I don't want to say that I write theoretically, but I kind of at this 50-foot, 1,000-foot level. But I mean, you live this. I mean,
Yep.
This was a direct result of how you found success by driving culture or designing that culture with intent, right? So, I mean, give some examples of how this actually played out in your career, how you saw that come to be.
But interesting, a lot of life is serendipity. Where we end up is usually not a product of some incredible design of a journey that I had in my head early on. I fell into IT. I was a bio major. I was actually good at it, so I got to turn around things. As you turn around things in a business like IT where there's so many problems, you get a lot of opportunities to do turnarounds. As you do turnarounds, pretty soon you're doing them across companies, and then I spotted a pattern. And the pattern was things were failing because no one understood how to get the best out of the people and build a high performing environment. And I realized that, social cohesion, which is relationships and how we fit together, which ultimately drives collaboration, was a completely misunderstood thing, unappreciated. And I started working a book. And I said people should know about this, appreciate it, and understand it.
So we're obviously in this unique setting, and you and I both have this deep love of wine. And so beyond the fact that we should just be drinking one of these bottles, there is a reason we're here. And so explain to us the relationship you see between culture and wine.
Well, culture really represents what people do that's great. And we remember great ancient cultures for their art, to be honest with you. And to me, wine is art. And most importantly, it's art you could share with others, like all great art. And every wine and every bottle has a story, and there's an artisan behind it. And in IT, we're craftsmen, and we have to work together to create our own art. Because at the end of the day, when you look at it, programmers are craftsmen and engineers in IT are craftsmen, and we're crafting these great works. They're craftsmen of the modern era. And I love wine because it's meant to be shared, and it's done by craftsmen, and it's fun.
And there's a unique flavor. I mean, not just the taste, but I mean literally how it's come. I mean, like I said, I love wine, and so I'm always fascinated how two different winemakers can take the exact same raw material, this grape juice, and it's how they combine it and mix it to bring it together that makes their bottle unique for good or bad. And I mean, it's similar, right?
Oh, it is so incredibly similar to companies that have great outcomes, because when you look at wine, it's not just the winemaker, which is really the artist that we talk about in IT, but for wine, it's the soil as well. They call it terroir. And for people who are working in an environment like a corporation, the soil is that culture and that environment that they're working in. So you could take great grapes and you can make terrible wine by putting them in a bad location. You could take great talent and have horrible outcomes by putting them in a very bad culture, because the soil's conductive and the culture is conductive.
Yeah, it's interesting, I think, because as we look at that, it stands in such stark contrast, in my opinion, to the way so many people look at, I mean, rather than just IT, business organizations, right? We tend to want to treat it like it's a machine. And here you're talking about how it's this finely crafted art of bringing it together. I mean, that's pretty different than what I think a lot of people think right now.
Yeah, I do believe that the future is going to be human understanding brought into the workplace. People will become experts at managing this human or talent infrastructure as well as they can manage a network. And in fact, that's how greatness will be produced. And it won't be by chance. It'll be because people understood how to create a high-performing culture or organization where both the people and the companies flourish. And that is the future. And when you look at the companies flourishing today, they're getting the talent culture piece right. No question in my mind.
And I think it's interesting, too, because I think we've been talking, GE brought forward this idea that human resources was a strategic differentiator. But I think in a lot of ways, we've still been treating that from the perspective of go hire the right people, get good incentive plans. But you're really talking about a much deeper level of this, of literally treating them with a discipline that we might treat our quote unquote other infrastructure, but without dehumanizing it, right? I mean, I think that's
right.
interesting.
I have a weekly newsletter that goes out. It's called The Rehumanization of Work. And that is, in fact, what's taking place. During the industrial era, we took the craftsmen of the prior era and dehumanized them by putting them into these industrial environments where we value them for their hands and being able to turn apart on an assembly line. Frankly, the rehumanization of work is all about bringing back this human understanding and caring about other people, like existed in craft shops in the 1700s, even in the early colonial days here, or craft shops in Europe. And that is without a doubt where we're heading, because that's where the winning companies are coming from. It's just a matter of time.
I mean, that's the funny thing. I mean, I think just as a human, I find that's just the right thing to do. But we are, I think, in this fascinating time, because it's also now, as you said, it's the companies that are winning are the ones that are figuring out how to do that right.
Absolutely. So a lot of it today comes down to getting leaders who innately know how to do this. If you look at what Google did, for instance, the founders cared about people deeply, but they also went to visit SAS, which was one of the best companies to work for, to say, what do you do that makes your place so great? And you have such great talent, and the talent produces, and they took those practices, embellished them, and that became Google. So they got it from the beginning. And if you have leaders that care about it and get it, you can do it. If you have leaders who don't care about it, then in fact it's a blind spot and they suffer the consequences.
Which unfortunately I think tends to be more the norm than
Yeah.
not. And what I struggle with is on so many levels, this seems so obvious. This seems very natural. I mean, nothing that you say, or I think that anybody who's listening or watching this sits there and goes, oh, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, it makes sense. Everyone
Yes.
can listen to that and say it makes sense. And yet, it doesn't happen, right? I mean, so why do you
Correct.
think that there's such an occurrence within IT organizations in particular, although I know you're starting to work more broadly across business, so I know this isn't unique to IT, but
Yes.
why is it that managers and leaders have such a hard time with this?
And that gets to the basic question, which is, why did I even have to discover this? Why was this serendipity that, in fact, I realized kind of human understanding and all the things that make people great, the human factors, were a blind spot? The fact of the matter is the industrial era didn't just dehumanize people, it made that knowledge completely unimportant. And therefore, as the modern corporation evolved at the turn of the century until today, it was a blind spot to the point where we call talent human resources, because you needed a lot of resources to run a factory, including talent. So at one time it was personnel, but we actually said the truth eventually. It was like the 1960s, they became human resources. And those resources are no different than the energy and the other raw materials you needed to run a factory.
Right. So I want to turn this a little bit more personal.
Sure.
So you've gone through this career journey of your own, and you've gone through this, the different challenges that many of us have that have kind of come up in the IT space. Was there any specific moment that began to crystallize this for you, where there was just this light bulb that went off and said, oh, I'm understanding now why this is different?
I'd become a CIO at a company. I was working at one company. I got a job to come in and do a turnaround transformation at a corporation of a division. And I walked in and I quickly realized that the problem, once again, was the human infrastructure was broken. So this wasn't a problem isolated to one company. This was much broader. And I realized that at that moment in time, it was a blind spot and I needed to dig into this. And I bought every book I could get my hands on to start reading about all different aspects of, talent and what have people written. Howard Gardner's book on multiple intelligences, Daniel Goleman's book, EQ. I was fascinated by humans and living things because I was a bio major. And it fit very well with me because that's what motivates me and drives me anyway. So for me, it was a fun part of the job.
Now, did you see that blind spot in yourself? Was this something that you had to start by identifying, hey, this is something I need to change within myself first?
I realized that I was employing practices and frankly, I was just doing it innately. I knew we had to have fun. I knew we had to collaborate and get along. I knew, in fact, if you set high expectations, somehow I knew it, that people rose to it. I guess over time I had witnessed that this stuff worked and began employing a set of tactics. And when I dug into it, you find out that there's probably 80 or 90 years of research in industrial organizational psychology and other things that make it very clear that this worked because it is a science, and that science has failed to be applied in the workplace, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's actually very old science, right? I mean, I think we
Yes.
have research that goes back, but I mean, I'm also a fan of kind of the classical. It goes back a long way. I mean, we've known these elements about human
Totally.
nature for a very long time.
You bet. There's really no mystery to it. There's a lack of education and understanding. I think it's been very trivialized and made unimportant, even at a moment where, Gallup says 71% of the people are disengaged at work, 30% are actively disengaged, 71% are...
I love that. What does actively disengage mean? I mean, like
Yeah.
they're actually literally going out and trying to undermine everything?
I think the actively disengaged is, I really hate the place. And, the disengaged one would be, I'm really not motivated.
Right.
I don't think they've gotten to the level of complete disgust.
I was
which is active disengagement.
we were just hosting a client advisory board meeting for a very large company, and one of the things that the CIO, as he presented, said that he gives people the option when they're responding to their urgency of how frustrated they are with the process.
Yeah.
One of the levels that they can literally choose is just kill me now.
Right?
I
love it.
Because I think it is. I mean, we have to acknowledge that
Yes.
we are creating environments that people literally get to that point, and if you don't respond to it, if you don't acknowledge it, they do just completely turn off.
And in reality, there is a sixth sense of leadership. And, I've been interviewed on the sixth sense of leadership. And the fact of the matter is, as a leader, you must know the baseline kind of behavior operating state of everybody. And to the degree you can, and you should notice changes, and you should go up to people and say, hey, you're looking a little down today. Or, you don't seem motivated, and dig into it and find out what's going on, because that's the equivalent of one of your servers shutting down completely, which the alarm bells would go off and you'd run around and be very worried about it. But because it's just part of the human infrastructure, we don't care.
It's interesting you said it, because I think that the analogy of saying that, well, if one of our servers was doing this, we wouldn't ignore it.
Oh, we'd care deeply.
Right.
The alarm would go off.
Right, exactly. Now, but what I find fascinating about that is, on the one hand, that feels like it's dehumanizing, right? It's like,
Yes.
oh, well, they're just a machine. But on the other hand, what I think it points out is the fact that our natural inclination is to say that that's not worth my time. I don't have time and energy.
Correct.
That's not productive or profitable to go spend that time. Just do your job, right? And so you're kind of looking at it differently, that this is your most important asset. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Most important asset. The people are assets. They're not expenses. Now, we could get into a long discussion on talent assets and talent expenses. Certain parts of talent are always being commoditized. But the people that count are assets. And you better understand where your assets are, and you better care about them operating at peak performance. And it's very simple to go over and say, empathy is noticing, right? And compassion's responding. Just to be a little empathetic and say, you look a little bit down. Can I help you? And you probably can't. Maybe you can. But just by asking, their mood goes up, and therefore their productivity goes up. And by the way, that's proven by research at Wharton University.
And isn't that ironic, right? So
Yes.
By viewing it as an asset, which is kind of the opposite of what we're talking about, we're actually creating a much more human environment in which people respond and react positively, right? I mean,
Correct.
It's
correct.
So going back to this moment at whatever point it was in your career where the light bulb kind of went off.
Yeah.
How did you react to that personally? What did you do differently once you kind of uncovered this secret?
I became very motivated to learn everything I could about it, and to try to understand it and realize that whatever I was doing, I could improve on it, for sure. Because if it was serendipity that I landed in this job, and it was somewhat serendipitous that whatever my personality type is, it matched the needs of that creative work environment, in fact, I realized I could do it better. So I became very, very driven to research it, dig into it, and try to employ new tactics to understand it better.
Were there any specific tactics that because I think there's sometimes this idea that it's like, oh, well, I need to be better at something,
yes.
right? But that's sometimes hard to do. It's like waking up every day and saying, I'm going to be happy, right?
Yes.
But sometimes it's easier to say, well, I'm going to do this specific thing. Was there anything specific when you say about specific tactics or actions that you started to put in place?
I'll give you an example. I realized that the mood or social climate was incredibly important, and I realized that there were human factors that were taking it down. So I began to map in my office what I saw as the organization and kind of a heat map of the place in terms of, what was the mood as I went through the place, was up or down. And if I found moods down or changing, I wanted to dig in and do something about it. I also would, do maps of relationships to try to understand what the state of relationships were. So if, I came to a meeting and I saw two people at opposite ends who I didn't think should be sitting that far apart, and repeatedly there was a lot of social separation, I knew there was a problem there. And I might go up and say, hey, you guys not getting along? What's cooking? Because them not getting along meant an awful lot of stuff that had to be talked about and happen on a project wasn't happening. So they must have had a falling out. And I need to know that. And I would dig in, because if those two parts of the infrastructure need to work together, guess what? You better dig in and get it working.
I mean, it's what I find so fascinating about your work, of how you are taking this very deliberate, almost scientific view of this very esoteric thing that is hard to understand. And I think that probably appeals to a lot of people in IT, because it helps make it a little bit more tangible. I mean, was that just naturally where you went with it? I mean, because I think it's a little bit unusual.
That's where I went with it. And, as I moved on, I began to talk about this stuff in town hall meetings. I actually had town hall meetings where I brought up a picture of the brain and talked about, this is the tool we're going to use. And, the limbic system is a threat sensor, and you could turn this piece of equipment off if you treat this other person in an antisocial way, or you threaten their survival. And we want all of the equipment working the best possible in this place, so we're going to collaborate. Yeah, I made this part of the mission, at least for me.
So you've been leader of, I don't know how many people know Guardian Life, but a very large Fortune 100, I think, company, right?
Fortune 200.
Okay, so but a big place,
big
right?
Place,
large
yeah.
staff. When you started going down this road and started engaging in these kinds of activities, how did people react? Did they think you were crazy? I mean, how did they respond?
Well, there are life lessons you learn along the way about this stuff. I know when I got to Guardian at my first town hall, I started talking about it and created a little bit of a stir in the background because people expect you to get up and talk about, we're going to work on the processes and everything. And by the way, I always said that was very important. We're going to do that too. So there was a whole strategy, but I realized it was better not to lead with that out of the box, to stick with the traditional stuff, but do all of it. And then as the place is turning around, people go, it's running great. To bring that forward as a piece of the equation. So the world, is getting much closer to the point where you would lead with that. That was certainly leading edge at the time. But we're getting there. And the important thing is we will get there, and this is where the difference is going to be made.
And I think on a personal level, so when you engage with people, I'm a huge believer of relationships. I mean,
Yes.
We've got one of our programs, and it starts with the first activity is just to learn how to listen, right?
Yes.
So when you engage at that level, because I think, my experience, a lot of times at these large Fortune 500 companies that are driven by, quarterly reports and all of that, that can be a very foreign thing. I mean, how did people react when suddenly they have their top executive who is bringing this kind of an approach to things?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I did all the traditional stuff. I mean, I had a strategy. We had strategies over all the dimensions we had to run. We built all the processes. I put governance models in place, very focused on security and risk management. I think we did those in a model way. Honestly, they're very important. Excellent financial management. So this was one dimension. Right? There are many, many dimensions. You've got to get all your processes down, which is how things work. You've got to get the organizational design done, which is a power structure, make sure people understand it. You've got to build your talent infrastructure out, do all the traditional things. You've got to get your culture right, which is how we work together. So to me, it was just a missing dimension.
So that's an important lesson here. This isn't
Yes.
about creating this touchy-feely environment
Not
in which
at
everyone
all.
kumbaya. It's one piece of this that you have to have all
Yes.
the pieces and parts.
And what we've learned about the other parts of the infrastructure and process and all the things that we've learned over time about leaning your process infrastructure and whatnot, these are critically important. And they all really, really, really matter. Believe me. And I didn't discount any of them. I wanted to focus on all the processes necessary, including culture, and how you go about building that and creating a collaborative environment.
So let's bring this home a little bit as we wrap this up. Imagine that I'm someone that you are mentoring, and I want to come and learn from all of your great lessons of
Yes.
your career and your journey. What is the one thing that you would tell me that I need to go do tomorrow that will help me start embracing this idea of shaping culture and all of these things that you're talking about?
I would start by saying that if you look at this tsunami of transformation that is hitting IT, where everything related to run the business is effectively moving to the cloud as a service. So all your infrastructure, all your traditional core, systems for HR and other things, your corporate systems, those are going to be in the cloud as a service. You're going to be left with those systems that absolutely create competitive advantage for the company and the talent, and figuring out your talent assets, becoming an expert at building these high-performing environments where you can innovate and create and outcompete everybody. That is what's going to differentiate leaders of this century. I absolutely believe that.
And so what's the first thing that I should do tomorrow to get myself down that road?
I'd get a reading list together. I would get my book. I would get Daniel Goleman's book, EQ. I would get Howard Gardner's book on multiple intelligences. I would get Paul Ekman's book, Emotion Revealed, which is all about the nonverbal cues that people use. There's just a ton of stuff to read. I would read it. I'd become fascinated by it. And I would start to try to employ techniques and become an expert at this as much as you could be one today.
I think it's an interesting answer from the standpoint of, I think a lot of people might look at this and say, well, is reading doing something? So, I mean, how is there either a technique, or, I mean, is just reading this, do you think that just to expand their perspective enough? That
It's going to expand their perspective, but you're going to have to employ it. And, of course, I'd be mentoring them, and I'd be showing them techniques to use to do it. So it wouldn't be a simple matter of saying, hey, I'm going to delegate this assignment to you, good luck. Mentoring is teaching. And,
so should they go try to find a mentor? Would that be something that you might
I would
do?
think so, yeah. Somebody who is absolutely great at managing this. They could learn a lot. I learned a lot along the way from people I worked for. And in a mentoring relationship where you don't work for them, they could be totally open and honest, and you could be vulnerable. That's very powerful.
Interesting. Well, Frank, this has been a fascinating conversation. I do hope people
follow up on what you're saying
Yep.
and read all of these books. In fact, maybe you can give us a list of those and we'll put them in the show notes here that
That'd be
people can
great.
actually go
I'll
through
do that.
And I think it's a fascinating journey, and I think you're a great lesson in that. So thank you very much for being on the show.
Thrilled to be here, and thanks for having me.
Wasn't that a fascinating and refreshing look at culture? What I love most about Frank's perspective on things is how he sees human infrastructure as an asset. But rather than that perspective being dehumanizing, it's the exact opposite. By seeing people as our most important asset, we are challenged to cultivate and protect that asset by treating people as humans rather than machines. I think it's a very refreshing perspective that might take you years to really dig into. If I can sum up his advice to all of us, it's that you need to be prepared for the massive changes that are coming and that will demand expertise in creating high-performing, highly innovative environments. And to do that, you need to start educating yourself on culture and on the emotion that drives each of us and our organizations. And you need to start putting that knowledge into action right away. But the first step is to be willing to accept that each of us must be in a constant state of learning, and that the most important things that we must be learning today have little to do with technology and everything to do with people. So that's your challenge. How can you begin or continue your lifelong learning journey and begin learning more about what drives each of us as humans? If you're watching this live, share your morning action with all of us right now using hashtag #ITChat, or post your morning action in the comments section here. Also, don't forget to take advantage of the many resources available to you. You can start at the Intel IT Center at www.intel.com/IT Center. And you can also check out all of our programs at the IT Transformation Institute at www.transformingit.org. Finally, in addition to reading Frank's book, which I hope you do, I hope you also read my book, The Quantum Age of IT, Why Everything You Know About IT is About to Change. If you haven't read it yet, well, our friends at Intel have made it easy for you by making copies available at 50% off the normal price for all viewers of the show. And if you're one of the first to register for the next show, you can get your copy for free. So that's a wrap on today's episode of the Transform IT Show. Thanks for joining us, and make sure you join us 2 weeks from now to participate in our live chat while you watch the episode. I'm Charles Araujo, and together we can change the world of IT.